Once again, welcome to the Citizen Soldier Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Scott Ryan Paulson, the Rooster of Tucson, here to wake you up to the situations in your neighborhood. Once again, coming to you live here from Hack Studios in Tucson, Arizona, aka Cartel Hell. Once again, welcome back, everybody. And you know, there's a saying you've probably heard more than once. You know, getting old isn't for the weak. And the funny thing is, most people hear that and automatically start slowing down. It's just part of the deal. You know, they accept that their aches and pains, their low energy, their weight gain, and losing strength are simply what happens after 40 years old. And me, I don't buy it. Yes, our bodies change. Recovery takes a little longer. We can't abuse ourselves the way we did in our 20s and expect to bounce back the next morning. Trust me, I do it all the time, but getting older, it doesn't mean giving up. It means training smarter. And today's episode isn't about chasing the body you had in high school. It's about building the body you'll need for the rest of your life. And think about that for a second. You know, most people spend more time researching their next television than they do their own health. They'll compare features, read reviews, and watch videos before making a purchase. Yet, they're going to ignore the one thing they use every single day: their body. Your body is your transportation. It's your toolkit. It's what gets you through work, takes care of your family, helps your neighbors, and allows you to enjoy your life. And if you neglect it, everything becomes even harder. Walking upstairs, getting out of bed like the Rice Krispies, snapple, crackle, pop, carrying your groceries, even playing with your kids or your grandkids. Even simple tasks begin to feel like extra work. Strength isn't just about lifting heavy weights. It's about preserving independence, my friend. And one of the biggest myths I've always heard is that it's too late to start. And at 40, at 50, even 60, that's simply not true. I've met people who completely changed their lives after 40 years old. They didn't become professional athletes. They became healthier, stronger, and more capable than they'd been in years. Not because they found a magic workout or some supplement, not because they, did extra push-ups, but because they became consistent. And that's the word people don't like. Consistency. It's not exciting. It doesn't sell magazines, but it's the coolest thing to a secret you'll ever find. You don't need the perfect workout, my friend. You need the workout you'll actually do. And you don't need the perfect diet. You just need to be better with your habits than you did yesterday. One good decision repeated 100 of times will always outperform 1 week of extreme motivation. That's how strength is built. Not overnight, one workout at a time, one meal at a time, one good habit at a time. And here's something that I've learned as well. Your goals change as you get older. In your 20s, maybe you wanted bigger arms or, a bigger bench press. After 40, you start asking way different questions. Like, can I hike without my knees hurting? Can I keep up with my kids? Can I avoid becoming dependent on someone else as I age? Can I wake up with energy instead of exhaustion? Those are better goals. They're goals that improve your quality of life. Strength isn't about impressing strangers at the gym. It's about building a body that supports the life you want to live. So today, we're going to talk about what really matters after 40 years old, my friends. Strength, mobility, recovery, nutrition, sleep, mindset. Like I said, no gimmicks, no miracle products, just practical ideas that can help you stay strong for decades to come. So, as always, get your coffee, let's settle in, and let's get started because one of the first things you realize after 40, my friends, is that your body keeps score. And the years of poor sleep, fast food on the way home from work, skipping workouts because life got busy, they eventually catch up with you. And the good news, your body also responds when you start treating it better. I've seen people make dramatic improvements without doing anything extreme. They started walking every day. They replaced soda with water. They lifted weights 3 or 4 times a week. They ate more protein and fewer processed foods. 6 months later, bam, they were almost unrecognizable. Not because they looked like bodybuilders, but because they moved better, felt better, and had more energy, that glow about them. And that right there is the goal. Progress, not perfection. And, one mistake I see all the time is people trying to train like they're 25 years old again. They spend 2 hours in the gym, they max out every exercise, and they ignore pain because they think pushing through it is going to make them tougher. And then they're sore for a week, and eventually they quit. I've seen it. Training after 40 isn't about proving how hard you can go. It's about proving how long you can keep going. I'd rather see someone complete 3 quality workouts every week for the next 10 years than 6 brutal workouts before giving up altogether. Longevity beats intensity every single time. And another thing that changes after 40 is recovery. Recovery isn't being lazy. Recovery is part of the program. Sleep becomes more important, hydration, mobility workouts become more important as well. Taking a rest day, it's not falling behind. It's giving your body the opportunity to come back even stronger. Trust me. Don't rush the process. Trust the process, my friend, because professional athletes, they understand this. They don't train hard every single day. They alternate between stress and recovery because that's how the body adapts. The same principles apply to the rest of us. We're not Superman. Let's talk about strength for a minute because people hear the word and immediately think about lifting the heaviest weight possible. And that's only one type of strength, and that can carry you. It can definitely carry you through situations, but can you climb a flight of stairs without getting winded? Can you pick something up off the floor without feeling like your hips are going to burst? That's real world strength right there. And that's the kind of strength that improves everyday life. And it doesn't require fancy equipment. Get a pair of dumbbells, some resistance bands, a bench, and your own consistency. And that's enough for most people to become significantly stronger over time. And here's another reality that nobody likes talking about. Muscle loss begins earlier than most people realize. And if you don't challenge your muscles, your body has no reason to keep them. And that's why resistance training matters. Muscles isn't just about appearance, people. It supports your joints. It improves balance. It helps maintain bone density. It even plays a role in how your body manages blood sugar. In other words, building muscles is one of the best long-term investments that you can make in your health. And then there's nutrition. People spend years searching for the perfect diet. Meanwhile, they ignored the basics. Eat enough protein, get your veggies, choose whole foods more often than processed garbage. Drink plenty of water, control your portions. Those habits aren't flashy. Trust me, it sucks. But they work. The fitness industry loves to sell you shortcuts. And the truth is, the fundamentals have never changed. Eat well, move often, lift something challenging, sleep enough to recover, repeat, my friends. And that's not exciting, but it is effective. And coming from somebody who's over 40, effective matters a whole lot more than trendy. So let's go ahead and talk about something that doesn't get enough attention. That's mobility. If strength is the engine, then mobility is the steering wheel. You can have all the muscles in the world, cock diesel style, but if your shoulders hurt every time you reach overhead, or your hips feel like locking up, getting up out of a chair, that strength isn't serving you the way it's supposed to. Mobility isn't about becoming a gymnast. It's about maintaining your range of motion so everyday life stays, well, every day. Getting into your truck, tying your boots, working out in your yard, or picking up your grandkids. Those are the moments that remind you why flexibility and joint health matter. And that right there is the best part. And it doesn't take hours, 5 or 10 minutes before and after your workout can make a noticeable difference over time. And another area that people overlook is balance. As we get older, balance becomes one of those abilities we don't ever think about until it's gone, until you fall in and you can't get up, if you catch my drift. And a stumble that would probably be nothing at 25 can be something serious, later on in life. And that's why simple exercises that improve stability deserve a place in your routine. Throw it in there. Strength isn't just about moving weights. It's about controlling your body. So let's go ahead and shift gears for a minute and talk about some mindsets, because, you walk into any gym and you'll see people comparing themselves to everybody else there. How much is that guy benching? How lean is she? How fast is he improving? Here's the problem with comparison. There's always going to be somebody stronger, somebody younger, always someone with more experience. The only comparison that really even matters is the one between who you were 6 months ago and who you are today. Are you stronger? Do you got more energy? Are your clothes fitting better? Can you walk farther without getting tired? Well, if the answer is yes, then you're winning, folks. Because progress doesn't always show up in the mirror first, trust me. Sometimes it shows up in your confidence, shows up in your blood pressure, and sometimes it shows up because your back no longer hurts when you wake up. And those victories count, my friend. And another lesson I've learned is this. Don't let one bad day become a bad week. Everyone misses workouts. Everyone eats something they probably shouldn't once in a while. Life happens. The mistake isn't missing one workout. The mistake is convincing yourself that you failed and giving up completely. Because fitness isn't about perfection. It's about returning to the plan as quickly as possible. Miss Monday? Well, guess what? Train Tuesday. You had pizza with the family? Well, eat better on your next meal. No guilt, no drama. Just get back on track, my friend. Consistency isn't built by never making mistakes. It's built by refusing to let mistakes become habits. And one thing I've noticed over the years is that the people who stay healthy the longest don't view exercise as punishment. They don't work out because they hate their bodies. They work out because they respect them. And that's a completely different mindset. You're not exercising because you have to. You're exercising because you still want to be active 20 years from now. You still want to hike, you want to travel, you want to play with your family, go work in the garage, enjoy retirement without constantly being limited by aches and pains. And that's a goal worth chasing, my friends. And here's something to remember as well. Nobody else can do this for you. Your doctor's not going to lift weights for you. Your trainer can't prepare your meals, and your friends can't build your discipline. They can encourage you. Hell yeah. They can teach you. But eventually, it's you walking into the gym. It's you making better choices at the grocery store. And it's you deciding that today's excuses aren't more important than tomorrow's health. Because every workout is a vote for the person you're becoming. And not overnight, not in 30 days, but over the course of years, my friends, those votes add up. One decision at a time, one rep at a time, and one day at a time. And as we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with something that's been on my mind as well. Your body doesn't know how old you are. It only knows how you treat it. And if you spent years sitting more than you have moving, your body responds to that. And if you've spent years getting stronger, eating better, and staying active, it responds to that as well. And the amazing thing about the human body is that it's always adapting. And the question is, what are you giving it to adapt to, my friends? You're over 40 when you make noises just standing up. You bend over to tie your boots, and suddenly you're wondering what else you could do while you're already down there. You throw your back out sleeping, and somehow you wake up sore from absolutely nothing. Welcome to the club, my friends. We've all been there. But here's the difference. Growing older is automatic. Growing weaker is not. You still have a say in how you age, my friends. Maybe you won't run as fast as you did 20 years ago, but hey, you're trying, you're making an effort, and maybe your recovery takes another day than normal. That's okay. Wisdom should replace ego. Train for the life you want, not the highlight reel you're trying to impress strangers with, okay? And here's a mental note. Stop comparing yourself to who you were 20 years ago. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday. And if you're making progress, then you're moving in the right direction. Your future self is watching you. The decisions you make today determine whether 60-year-old you says, "I'm glad I started," or "I wish I would have did that when I had the chance." And trust me, people, nobody has ever finished a workout and said, "I really regret exercising today." But plenty of people regret not taking care of themselves when they had the chance to. And life is too short to spend it feeling tired all the time. And it's too short to avoid adventures because you're out of shape. It's too short to sit on the sidelines when you could be out there living your life. Take that hike, go lift the weights, cook the healthy meals, and get the sleep and drink the water, baby. Do the boring things consistently because those boring things create extraordinary results over time. And remember this, discipline isn't punishment. It's freedom. The stronger you become, the more life asks of you, and the more capable you are of answering. So here's your challenge before our next episode. Move every single day. It doesn't have to be perfect. Take a walk, lift some weights, stretch, go ride a bike, do something that reminds your body it was built to move. Because momentum is a powerful thing. Protect it, build it, and keep it going. And finally, don't forget to enjoy the journey, my friends. Treat yourself. Don't cheat yourself. Laugh when you can, my friends. Encourage someone who just don't get it. Maybe they need a pat on the back. You have to celebrate the small victories out there, because fitness isn't a finish line. It's a lifestyle, and one that pays dividends every single year if you stick with it. Once again, I'm Ryan Paulson, the Rooster of Tucson. Once again, reporting live here from Hack Studios in Tucson, Arizona, a.k.a. Cartel Hell. That's right. Watch out for those fentanyl zombies, Tucson. They're everywhere. And bring some deodorant outside. Maybe some air freshener. Maybe spray the air while you're out there and get rid of that fentanyl smell. But anyways, if today's episode motivated you, challenged you, or reminded you to invest in yourself, then share it with somebody who needs to hear it. A training partner, a friend, a family member who's been saying, I'll start next Monday. Maybe this is their Monday, my friend. Once again, until next time, stay strong, stay disciplined, and stay dangerous. Once again, take care of your body, sharpen your mind, and never stop becoming a better version of yourself. Once again, to all the citizen soldiers, we will see you next episode. Over and out.